Welcome to Royal Insights, where we explore the stories, traditions, and fascinating details behind royal families and dynasties from around the world. Join us as we uncover the history, culture, and curiosities that connect crowns across continents.
The queens who ruled Europe, women who changed history. For most of European history, there was a rule so obvious that almost nobody bothered to write it down. Kings ruled. Men inherited thrones, men commanded armies, men sat in council chambers and decided the fate of nations. Power moved from father to son, from brother to brother, from husband to heir. Women could be useful, of course. They could marry strategically, forging alliances between dynasties through the simple act of crossing a border as a bride. They could advise in private, whisper in the right ear at the right moment, shape decisions without ever appearing to make them. They could raise future kings and be quietly, invisibly influential in ways that history rarely recorded. But sit on the throne themselves? Actually rule? That was a different matter entirely. And here is the paradox that makes this story so fascinating. Despite that assumption, despite centuries of laws, customs, religious doctrine, and political theory all pointing in the same direction, some of the most successful monarchs Europe ever produced were women. Not great female monarchs, great monarchs, full stop. Rulers whose decisions reshaped borders, transformed institutions, and left marks on history so deep that we still feel them today. But before they were legends, they were something else entirely. They were problems nobody knew what to do with. Here is something history tends to forget. When we hear names like Elizabeth I, Catherine the Great, or Maria Theresa, we picture power. We picture the finished portrait, the formal pose, the crown, the absolute authority radiating from every brushstroke. We don't picture what came before, the years of uncertainty, the moments of genuine danger, the long stretches of time when these women had no guarantee whatsoever that they would survive long enough to rule anything. Take Elizabeth Tudor. Her father was Henry VIII, a king so determined to have a male heir that he dismantled the church, dissolved the monasteries, and married 6 different women in pursuit of a son. A king who executed 2 of his wives. One of them was Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, beheaded when Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old. Imagine growing up inside that story. At various points in her childhood, Elizabeth was declared legitimate, then illegitimate, then restored to the line of succession, then removed again. She was imprisoned in the Tower of London as a young woman, suspected of involvement in a plot against her half-sister, Queen Mary. She survived that. She survived everything. And when she finally became queen in 1558 at the age of 25, she inherited a kingdom fractured by religious conflict, economically fragile, surrounded by larger and more powerful neighbors who were already calculating how to take advantage of her. The conventional wisdom of the era was not encouraging. Some of the most respected political thinkers of the 16th century had written entire treatises arguing that female rule was, by its very nature, defective, unnatural, a temporary disorder in the proper arrangement of things. Elizabeth spent the next 45 years answering that argument without ever directly engaging it. Under her reign, England repelled the Spanish Armada, the most powerful naval force of the era. English explorers pushed into new continents. Trade expanded, the arts flourished in ways that gave the world Shakespeare, Marlowe, and an entire tradition of literature. And a kingdom that had looked, at the moment of her accession, like a secondary power on the margins of European affairs, became something considerably more significant. Historians still call it the Elizabethan Age. Very few rulers, male or female, from any era, get an entire period of history named after them. If Elizabeth's story is about proving yourself against doubt, Maria Theresa's story is about proving yourself against invasion. In 1740, her father, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI, died without a male heir. He had spent years negotiating a document called the Pragmatic Sanction, a formal agreement signed by most of the major European powers that would allow his daughter to inherit his territories. It turned out that formal agreements are worth considerably less than armies. Within months of Maria Theresa becoming ruler of the Habsburg lands, Prussia invaded Silesia. Bavaria claimed parts of her inheritance. France saw an opportunity. Spain saw an opportunity. Saxony saw an opportunity. Virtually every neighboring power looked at a 23-year-old woman newly on the throne with a husband who had no military reputation and an army in disarray and reached the same conclusion. Now, what happened next was one of the most dramatic reversals in 18th century European history. Maria Theresa did not collapse. She did not negotiate from weakness. She appeared before the Hungarian Diet, the parliament of her Hungarian subjects, holding her infant son, and delivered an appeal for military support that became legendary. The Hungarians, moved by the gesture and by genuine loyalty to the Habsburg cause, raised an army. She fought back. She didn't win everything. She lost Silesia to Prussia permanently, a wound that would shape Central European politics for generations. But she held the core of the Habsburg Empire together against opponents who had expected easy conquest. And then she did something that distinguished her from many rulers who survived by instinct alone. She reformed. She modernized the administration of her territories. She restructured the military. She expanded education, including, remarkably for the era, elementary schooling for girls. She overhauled the tax system to make it more equitable. She governed across a reign of 40 years with a combination of tenacity, intelligence, and genuine administrative ability that impressed even those who had initially dismissed her. Frederick the Great of Prussia, the very man who had invaded her territories and stolen Silesia, reportedly said of her, years after the conflict, "She has honored her throne and her sex." High praise, wrapped in the condescension of the era, but from Frederick, a monarch famous for his contempt of weakness, it meant something. What made Maria Theresa exceptional was not just that she survived a crisis. It was that she used the crisis to become a better ruler than she might have been without it. The pressure that her enemies applied, expecting it to destroy her, instead forged her. If there is one figure in this story whose rise seems almost fictional, it is Catherine the Great. Because Catherine wasn't supposed to rule Russia. She wasn't even Russian. She was born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess from a family so small and so obscure that it barely registered on the map of European power. Her father was a Prussian general. Her mother was ambitious, socially connected, and relentlessly focused on finding her daughter the best possible marriage. The best possible marriage turned out to be the heir to the Russian throne. At the age of 15, Sophie arrived in Russia. She converted to Russian Orthodoxy, took the name Catherine, learned the language with remarkable speed, and began the long process of understanding a court that was simultaneously magnificent and dangerous. Her husband, Peter, was erratic, possibly mentally unstable, and openly contemptuous of Russia, the country he was supposed to one day rule. Catherine watched. She read voraciously. She cultivated allies. She corresponded with the great Enlightenment philosophers of Europe, Voltaire, Diderot, D'Alembert, building an intellectual reputation that extended far beyond the Russian court. And when Peter III finally became Tsar and almost immediately began making catastrophically unpopular decisions, reversing Russian military gains, alienating the Orthodox Church, antagonizing the palace guard, Catherine moved. In June of 1762, she rode into St. Petersburg on horseback, dressed in the uniform of the Russian Imperial Guard, and accepted the loyalty of the army. Peter abdicated. He died shortly afterwards in circumstances that remain historically murky. Catherine became Empress of Russia at 33. She would rule for 34 years. Under her reign, Russia expanded dramatically into territories that had belonged to Poland, the Ottoman Empire, and the Crimea. She founded universities. She established the Hermitage Collection, which became one of the world's great museums. She overhauled the legal system. She corresponded with and invited to her court the leading intellectuals of Europe. But here's what I find most remarkable about Catherine. She had no inherited claim to Russia, none whatsoever. She was a foreigner. Her husband was dead under suspicious circumstances. She had no bloodline to hide behind, no dynastic legitimacy to appeal to. Everything she built on demonstrated competence, political intelligence, and the ability to make herself indispensable to the people who mattered. In a world where royal legitimacy was supposed to flow from birth, Catherine proved it could also be constructed, deliberately, brick by brick, over decades. When you look at these three women, Elizabeth, Maria Theresa, Catherine, a pattern emerges that I don't think is coincidental. None of them were supposed to succeed. Elizabeth was the daughter of a disgraced queen, declared illegitimate before she could walk. Maria Theresa faced a continent of neighbors who had assumed a woman couldn't hold what her father had built. Catherine had no legitimate claim to power at all, and yet all three not only survived, they thrived. There's something important here about the relationship between adversity and capability. Each of these women governed in systems that openly doubted them, which meant that every decision they made was watched more closely, every mistake was magnified more harshly, every success had to be so undeniable that even their critics couldn't dismiss it. A mediocre king could muddle through. History is full of mediocre kings who held their thrones for decades without ever doing anything particularly impressive or disastrous. A mediocre queen in the 16th or 18th century would have been replaced, sidelined, married off, or worse. The standard was higher, and the women who survived that standard were exceptional, almost by definition. There is also something worth noting about the quality of their attention. Each of these women was, by all historical accounts, a voracious learner. Elizabeth mastered multiple languages and used them as political tools in her diplomatic correspondence. Maria Theresa educated herself in law, finance, and military strategy with a thoroughness unusual even for monarchs of the era. Catherine read everything, corresponded with everyone, and deliberately constructed an intellectual identity that was inseparable from her political one. They understood, intuitively, something that many rulers never learn, that power maintained purely through birth and precedent is fragile. That genuine authority requires demonstrated competence, that the world will eventually demand proof, and they were ready to provide it. Today, the idea of a woman leading a country doesn't shock anyone. Female presidents, prime ministers, chancellors, and heads of state appear across the political map of the world. The conversation has moved on. The question is no longer whether women can lead. History answered that definitively. But how to ensure the systems that choose leaders reflect that reality. It's easy to forget how recently that shift happened, and how much resistance preceded it. The queens who ruled Europe did not live in an era moving steadily towards equality. They lived in an era of formal, explicit, legally encoded male dominance. The systems they operated within were not designed to accommodate them. Many of the people around them, advisors, diplomats, rival monarchs, actively believed that female rule was a deficiency to be managed rather than a capability to be respected. And against that backdrop, they built empires, survived wars, passed reforms, reshaped the intellectual and cultural life of their nations, left marks on history so durable that we still measure time by their names. What they were doing, without necessarily framing it this way, was expanding the range of what seemed possible, not through argument, not through manifesto, but through the most powerful form of persuasion available: example. When Elizabeth defeated the Armada, it became slightly harder to argue that women couldn't lead in wartime. When Maria Theresa held the Habsburg Empire together against multiple simultaneous invasions, it became slightly harder to claim that women couldn't govern in a crisis. When Catherine transformed Russia into a major European power over 3 decades, the case against female rule became slightly more difficult to make. None of this happened quickly. None of it happened cleanly. The progress was uneven, contested, and frequently reversed. But it happened, and the mechanism was simpler than we sometimes imagine. They showed up. They governed. They refused to fail quietly. And somewhere in the long aftermath of their reigns, the extraordinary became ordinary, and the ordinary became expected, and the expected became, eventually, unremarkable. That transformation, slow, contested, and incomplete as it was, may be the most lasting thing any of them built, greater perhaps than any empire.